Hello. So it's another week of going through the book of Daniel, and last week we did the first half of Daniel chapter 9, verses 1 to 19. This week we're just going to look at the rest of Daniel chapter 9, which is verses 20 to 27. Why don't you hit pause, get a drink, have a read? There's no point. Well, there is a point. You can listen to this, but actually it's without reading the Bible. But it is more helpful having read the verses first. So when you go ahead and read them and come back to us, it's Daniel chapter 9, verses 20 to 27. So last week we looked at verses 1 to 19 in chapter 9, which was Daniel's prayer. And this week we get another vision and another interpretation. And much like Daniel 8, there's some good news in this vision and interpretation, and there's some bad news. Although we must have a balanced view when looking at this interpretation. These verses have been looked at by theologians for years and years, and there is still not a broad agreement on what these verses exactly mean. So we must hold all people's writings about this passage quite lightly. So I'm going to do my best to summarize some of the thoughts and beliefs there are around these verses. It's believed by many that these 70 sets of 7 that it refers to is 70 weeks, and that each day in these 70 weeks represents a year. But not all people think that. The number 7 often comes up in the Bible this way. I mean, look at when Jesus is asked how many times should he forgive someone, and Jesus says 70 times 7. Sounds familiar. He's not saying we should forgive somebody 490 times, but he is using this as a round figure to represent always. So some see this 70 times 7 as an undeterminable amount of time, just like forgiving people an undeterminable amount of times. However, some believe that, as I say, this 70 times 7 is 70 weeks, and each day resembles a year. So that's 490 years. And they think that because when you follow the timeline of the Bible and this dream, two things would coincide. The death of Christ would happen at the end of the 69th week, roughly 483 years later. Some would think then that the 70th week represents the 7 years of tribulation. Some people don't believe that. And obviously that time is yet to come. And some people even think that weeks 68, 69 and 70 represents Christ's first coming, the gap in between, and Christ's second coming. So you can see that there are some different thoughts about what these numbers mean. And I'm sure there's many more different interpretations than what I've just shared as well. But some things are certain, okay? So this vision talks of the restoration of God's people to Jerusalem. And that happened. This vision also talks of the coming of and the death of Jesus, the anointed one. And at a time of trouble, and that a time of trouble for the people of Jerusalem would come. Some writers think that this trouble is the desecration of the temple that refers to the work of Antiochus IV in 168 BC. Some people think that this time of trouble is the destruction of the temple by Titus in AD 70. And some people think that this trouble is to be fulfilled in the future by the Antichrist. So as you can see, there are some different interpretations there. However, similarly to Daniel 8, we must hold on to the truths that we know. These verses talk of the coming and the death of Jesus just as it's written in Daniel 8. And it's written here in verse 27 that God will put an end to the desolation. This is the return of Jesus Christ. And we can easily get caught up in the destruction and the desolation narrative here. But I would rather be caught up in the narrative of no matter what the enemy throws at us, when he throws it, doesn't matter. What matters is that God wins. We have the victory over the enemy no matter what it looks like and when it happens. We still have the victory, okay? Regardless of what happens. Why? Because Jesus Christ, our Saviour, has claimed that victory for us. And Philippians calls us to dwell on the excellent, noble and praiseworthy things. Surely focusing on the victory we have in Jesus Christ is one of those things over the persecution and destruction we might face and when we might face it. And a final encouragement in this. At the start, Gabriel comes and tells Daniel that whilst he was praying in verses 1 to 19, not only was that prayer being heard, but it was also being acted upon. God hears our prayers. Not only that, but he acts upon them as well. So let's use these verses as well as a reminder that God wins, but also as an encouragement that God is listening, that God hears your prayers and will and does act on them. We can be encouraged by that. We can't determine the outcome of what God will do, but we know he's hearing and acting on our prayer life. God does that, and God determines the outcome, not us. So let's be a praying people, because I'd rather be praying and speaking to God knowing he's listening and acting than sticking my head in the sand. And when we do that, we will find ourselves closer to God, no matter what the world around us looks like.